Howdy folks, and welcome to another edition of RandomJank. Now, this week's episode I decided to do something that kind of from the beginning I was kind of hesitant to do because I didn't want to do a lot of like how-to videos or, really show off too much expertise because, I don't know, I personally don't think I have too much. But there is something very basic that most Magic players need to learn how to do, especially if they ever start wanting to go to F&Ms or do something other than just play with their friends. And that is how to make at least a somewhat decent 60-card Magic deck. Now, there's a very specific reason why I just said 60-card Magic deck. In Standard, the minimum number of cards that you can have in your deck is 60, and you want to stay at 60 as much as possible. Now, the reason behind this is that since your deck can only have a certain number of cards in it anyways, if you just overstuff it with cards that don't really work well together or that you don't really know if they're actually going to be able to stop your opponent, having only 60 is going to make it so that your best cards come up a lot more often. Now, another thing that a lot of beginners, or at least when I was a beginner, I kind of didn't do all that much of, is put a lot of stock into land. Now, in a 60-card deck, you want to have enough lands to be able to do anything that you want to do when the need arises for it. Most of my decks usually run about 22. Sometimes I run 23. I think one of them has 25 because there's a lot of expensive things in there, and I want to make sure that when I get that 7 mana cost creature, I can actually cast it. Mana is probably the most important thing that you have to worry about. Now, if you have a multicolored deck, you're going to want to try and invest a little bit more money into the multicolored lands. They're going to be a lot more expensive than just the basic ones because just about every booster pack has a basic land in it. When you're taking your 60 cards, you want to make sure that, like in the sealed deck that I was telling you about, your deck has a theme. Your deck has a way of actually beating your opponent. Now, it could be a creature like, say, Biovisionary, where you have 4 copies of that card and you try to get out as many Biovisionaries as possible. It could be Life Gain, where everything in your deck has life gain stuff. If it has lifelink, or if it has enters into play, you gain X life. If it has damage prevention type things. Basically, you want to have a very specific mindset for how you want to win, and you want to have as many of your cards as possible working towards that goal. You don't want to just have a bunch of jumbled up cards that look really, really cool, but don't really do the same thing, or at least very similar things. The worst thing that you can do in anything in terms of making decks is, instead of making your own deck better, seeing what everybody else is playing and just building a deck to counter that. You want to be able to do something that's really strong on its own. If you're just building a deck to counter other people's decks, you don't have that theme going. You don't have something that's really strong and powerful that can hold its own. You're just doing something against something else. Makes it a lot less fun for you, and the chances of you actually winning when you go to play against other people or maybe at another card store or whatnot, your chances are going to drop because the people that are playing decks are going to be different from store to store to store. Now, when you're making a constructed deck, except for basic lands, you can have a maximum of 4 copies of any given card. And you want to take advantage of that. If there's a card that you really need to win, or if your main theme has, let's say your main theme is ramping, so you have a lot of things like rampant growths or far seeks, things that actually bring out mana a lot faster, try to play the maximum of 4 as often as possible. The only time you want to avoid something like this is when your main win condition is something like a Hellkite Tyrant or a Door to Nothingness. So depending on what kind of format that you're playing for, if it's standard, if it's block constructed, if it's modern, whatever, most of the time when Wizards comes out with a new set or a new block, all the cards within that set and block work very well together. For example, the cards in Return to Ravnica and Gatecrash. I know I've talked a lot about it, but it actually feeds the example. Let's say you're choosing Selesnya. It's a very token-based type of thing. You have a lot of populate, you have a lot of token generators. For the most part, Ravnica is about, or that particular color combination in Ravnica is about tokens. However, the previous block, Innistrad, had a lot of token generators, and it had something like Intangible Virtue to help out your tokens. 99% of the time, it's a really good idea to stick with the cards in a set, but if there are cards in a previous set that still stays in the format that you want to play in, don't hesitate to try and pull cards from that as long as it makes your deck as solid as possible. There's a really big issue with Magic that I've kind of avoided with all these videos that I've done, but at this point, if we're going to be making a video about doing decks, I have to address it. It's the money issue. Now, if you take a look at my other videos, most of my decks only come across around maybe the $100 range maximum, and they're all standard, because I don't want to invest in a lot of older cards that I might not be able to play with everybody that I meet up with. However, even in standard, there's a lot of high-priced cards that Well, they're high priced because they're really good. Most of the time, let's take a look at Bonfire of the Damned. Now, at the time of this video, it's actually ranked at $40. But it's an absolute sweeper. You're pretty much destroying your opponent's team in one fell swoop, potentially even killing your opponent in one shot if it comes out late enough. Now, the way these prices are gauged is actually with the Magic Pro Tour. There's a lot of professional Magic players, and because of that, some of the cards are going to be worth a lot more than some of the other cards. The biggest piece of advice that I can give you, besides just spending a lot of money, is look at the Pro Tour people. Because if you see what decks they have that work, and you already have those cards, it makes it a lot easier. But the second big piece of advice is, don't just use a card that's similar. What you want to do is try to make your own deck stronger, and you're actually going to be crippling yourself if you're going to be using a card that's similar, but not quite the same thing. For example, let's say, randomly speaking, that one of the Pro Tour players is using a card called Artful Dodge. It's a sorcery that grants any of your creatures unblockability one time, maybe twice if you use the flashback. Now, there are other cards that give unblockability. Things like Way of the Thief, which if you're playing with Guild Gates, that would be okay. It's an enchantment, which is nice, but it also costs 4 more mana, and it's not doing what you want to do necessarily. Something like Artful Dodge is good for a one-time burst on a big creature that you know is going to be ending the game with. Something like Way of the Thief is going to be used more for pinging and wanting to slowly dwindle down your opponent's life total if you have the opportunity to. The problem is, because it's an enchantment, somebody could just flat out destroy the creature whenever they want to. So you're not getting a lot of value there. Make sure to use cards in your deck that are going to make your deck better. Don't just copy off of somebody else, especially if it's using cards that you don't fully understand. Sometimes it happens. There's a lot of interactions in a game that has over 10,000 different cards, so don't expect to learn everything all at once, but do your best to make sure that your deck has a theme. Well, that's all I have to say about constructing decks this week. I would actually like all of my viewers to be commenting down below with the types of decks that they actually use for themselves, or the decks that they absolutely hate using or being played against. My personal favorite to hate on is Reanimator. Anytime I see a Thragtusk get hit on the ground and I kill it, I know it's just coming back with something, and I hate seeing Thragtusks everywhere. Well, that's it for me. I hope you enjoyed the video. Be sure to comment, share it with your friends, and I will see you next Friday. A Visionary on its own is great, but you're also going to want to have something on the ground to stop your opponent from hitting you all the time. Druid's Deliverance is fine too, but something a little bit more attack-worthy. One that predominantly the game is kind of built around and that most people are going to be playing with their friends anyways. Now, there are 2 different single-player versions. There's Limited and Constructed.